Thanks so much, Franklin. I'm Ron Chernow, a very proud past president of PEN America, and I'm honored to present the 2020 PEN America Voice of Influence Award to none other than President Barack Obama. Doesn't get any better than this, folks, does it? Like PEN America, Barack Obama has always stood at the intersection of literature and human rights. 26 years ago, his memoir, Dreams from My Father, revealed an acute self-awareness, a deep humility, and a distinctive ability to transcend the historic divides of American society. Both book and author leapt from the written page to the public stage. President Obama's next book, The Audacity of Hope, rekindled the sense of possibility in a sometimes weary and frustrated nation. He understood that nothing about the freedom to write is ever guaranteed, and he rose to defend writers, journalists, and activists around the world who had paid the steepest price for exercising their right to free expression. Now President Obama has brought his majestic prose, his panoramic vision, and piercing insights to the first volume of his new presidential memoir called A Promised Land. PEN America honors President Obama for the power of his soaring words, the promise he has unlocked in our nation, and the enduring American values that he has embodied. It is my very special privilege to bestow this award and invite President Obama to join me in conversation about the very heart of PEN America's historic mission, the freedom to write. Welcome, Mr. President. Congratulations on this mighty honor, one of many that you have received. And we're all so grateful that you have decided to join the PEN America virtual gala.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and to PEN, to my fellow honorees, and to you, Ron. I want to just express my gratitude. I think it's been noted that I'm a wannabe writer who ended up somehow falling into politics. So to be recognized in this way by an organization that not only represents extraordinary literary talents, but also has fought the good fight for the freedom of expression, not just here, but around the world. That is a great honor, and I'm humbled and grateful for it.
Thank you. I think we can safely say you're a little bit more than a wannabe writer. You know, I confess, Mr. President, that I opened A Promised Land with excitement, but also some trepidation. Dreams from My Father was such a beautifully crafted and lyrical book that I found myself wondering whether, after 8 years in the White House, where you had to weigh every word and parse every sentence, whether you would be able to go back to writing with the freedom that you had enjoyed before. That is, to put it bluntly, I wondered whether when you sat down to write it, you felt, well, maybe I've lost it as a writer after 8 years in Washington. Was that a concern?
The one thing that I didn't stop doing while president was reading. And I think that continually informed how I saw the world. Great writers helped shape my sensibility and the decisions that I made. And that probably preserved somewhere in the recesses of my mind the possibility that when I started writing again something other than speeches, that even though it was a little rusty, I could get back into that kind of frame of mind.
You know, Mr. President, I feel that so much of your career has revolved around words, whether spoken words or written words. And has being a writer been an important part of your identity, and exactly when and how did that start?
Well, as I describe in the book, I trace back actually my interest in politics to my interest in books. Growing up in Hawaii, a child of mixed race, father's not there. My mother was frequently absent because of her travels. And I'm trying to figure out, where do I fit? What's my place in the world? And what I found was that I could maybe construct some sense of meaning for myself through the conversation I was having with books and authors. But I think it also leads me to a set of values, and that led me to figure out how I could express that not just in a private way, but also in a public way. In that sense, my politics, my public life, and my more interior writing life have never been that far apart.
Can you give us a picture of yourself writing this memoir? Did you, on the one hand, sit down and primarily write this out of your memories, or were you sitting there with stacks of inter-office memos and recollections from staffers, and did it feel liberating not to be surrounded any longer by a team of White House speechwriters?
So I'm sitting at a desk with my yellow pads. I'm very particular about the pens I like because I write a first draft out in longhand. And at the end of each chapter, I would then do my own fact-checking initially. You can type in a date and basically see everything that at least was on my public schedule for that day. But really, I ended up writing this more as a story, and I think the battle for me was wanting to maintain the interest of a lay reader, to get a sense of what it is like for somebody who they can maybe identify with as a young man or a father or a husband, who then takes this extraordinary journey through the strange experience of being president, and trying to balance telling a story while still providing a fair historical accounting, I think was the big wrestling match that I had throughout the book.
PEN America for, about a century now, PEN and its affiliates abroad, we've fought the good fight on behalf of persecuted and imprisoned writers, both here and abroad. And I was wondering, Mr. President, for all those PEN staffers and PEN members who have labored down in the trenches on these long drawn-out campaigns to get the release of this repressed dissident writer or that, it would be wonderful to know, whether these sorts of human rights campaigns, do they actually kind of percolate up to the level of the State Department or the White House? What is the importance of a group like PEN America, or the entire constellation really of nonprofit human rights organizations, to people who are holding public office in Washington?
I'm glad you framed the question that way, because I want the staffers and the people who are carrying the laboring oar day to day on these issues to know it does impact foreign policy and it does impact presidential decision making. I was consistently raising issues of jailed journalists, jailed dissidents, censorship issues, freedom of the press issues in conversations that I would have, whether it was Vladimir Putin or President Hu and President Xi or any number of other world leaders. And there were a number of occasions where, as a consequence of us being aware of the plight of a journalist or a dissident, a human rights activist, that making it onto the agenda of a conversation that I had, that it ended up resulting in somebody's freedom. And more than that, I think beyond the individual case, what it does is it sets a standard of conscience that percolates throughout the international community. It changes the conversation over time such that we're better off than we would have been if we just cynically said this isn't going to make any difference at all. We're not going to get to a point where we can eliminate all censorship, all cruelty, all abuse of power, but we can lessen those trends and those tendencies over time, and that's the difference that an organization like PEN can make.
We at PEN America, we love the sense of a worldwide community of human rights activists, because that's really the very essence of the organization. I wonder, that community of worldwide activists, do you think it's as strong today as it was, say, in the days of Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr. or Nelson Mandela? Or has the rise of all of these authoritarian, illiberal, nationalistic regimes around the world really eroded the power of that community?
Well, I think that history moves in cycles, and we are now in an ongoing contest of ideas. There is a vision of what the world could be that I think Penn embraces, that many of the writers who are part of your organization describe, one that recognizes human dignity and freedom and equality and fairness. And I think right after the Cold War, with Russia and the old Eastern Bloc nations back on their heels, China just emerging, into re-entering the world post-cultural revolution, I think that it felt as if that spirit was ascendant. Right? Mandela's released from prison, and you see Europe unified, and there's glimmers of hope that China's going to politically liberalize as well as economically liberalize. And then you get a backlash, not just in those countries, but here in the United States. And that contest between a vision of humanity that recognizes the dignity of all individuals and believes that we can work collectively to make the world more kind and more just and more free, and voices are heard, and we are good stewards for the planet, that wrestles with a much more ancient attitude towards human relations that's based on power and domination, and in which strong men emerge, and we're in the middle of that contest. Here's the good news, though, Ron. I do think that as I travel around the world, or at least pre-COVID when I was traveling around the world, the spirit that I believe in, I saw alive and well among young people everywhere. It didn't matter whether it was in Prague or Tel Aviv or Buenos Aires or Ho Chi Minh City. You saw more and more young people embracing the kinds of values that I think Penn has stood for. The challenge we have is that our institutions have not adapted as quickly, which is why the younger generation often doesn't have the same mechanisms to express their idealism. Oftentimes they're disappointed with existing political structures, existing media structures. Those are going to have to be remade. And it'll take some of us old folks getting out of the way so that they can remake them.
Let's talk a little bit about the always fraught subject of the presidency and the press. We have gone through 4 years of the most unbelievably hostile and confrontational attitude toward the press. How deep do you think the damage has been, and can we repair this breach and get back to somewhat more civilized relations between president and press, which are always difficult?
By definition, the press should be a little bit of a thorn in the side of power, and in the United States that means poking and prodding the president. And presidents don't like being poked and prodded all the time, and I record in my book all the times that I think the press is unfair to me. But what I never lost sight of, and what I think has been our tradition, is the recognition that the Fourth Estate is vital to a functioning democracy. The notion that you would threaten them or call them an enemy of the state or try to delegitimize a press that does the job of fact-checking and expecting evidence when you float accusations. That kind of bullying behavior we haven't seen to the extent that we've seen it recently. The good news is I think that you're going to have a new administration that level sets back to the norm. The bigger challenge, I think, Ron, is going to be what is happening inside the press itself. The dissolution of journalistic standards that we had all come to expect in mainstream journalism, a lot of that has crumbled. And so what you now have is a variety of very powerful news outlets that have no problem not just repeating falsehoods or misinformation, but disseminate them themselves. And the lines have blurred now between propaganda and what we would consider journalism in a way that has been described as truth decay. You know, you've got a epistemological problem where people don't know now entirely what's true and what's not. And the old authorities and curators of what is factual are greatly weakened. And that's dangerous for our democracy. And I don't think that that's going to be solved just by a new president. I think internally, news organizations and all of us culturally are going to have to think about what to do about that. How do we preserve freedom of the press when you've got an internet in which somebody who denies climate change or promotes wild conspiracy theories can put up a website that is getting as many viewers as the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal? And if that's the case, and people can choose whatever news or facts fit their opinions rather than having their opinions fit the facts, can we still have a functioning marketplace of ideas? If you ask me, one of the things I'm most worried about long-term for democratic values, this is the one.
Well, you know, certainly conspiracy theories have only proliferated in the world of social media, but of course we did have conspiracy theories going back even to President George Washington, who was accused in the press of plotting to restore the British monarchy. He was accused at one point of having been a British secret double agent throughout the Revolutionary War. Obviously, the British got a very bad return on their investment. And you know, Mr. President, Washington at first decided that he was not going to dignify this nonsense with a response. But then he realized that a lie, if it's repeated often enough, will be believed. And in his second term, he wrote a fascinating letter in which he likened it to water dripping on a stone. And he said, if water drips on a stone long enough, you know, it will leave a mark. You had to deal with conspiracy theories kind of notably with Donald Trump and the birtherism, where you kind of, you know, waited quite a while. I'm sure it was difficult, and then kind of, you know, finally responded to it. What was kind of the turning point that you finally decided to respond to that? And what was your policy generally in terms of responding to this kind of vicious nonsense that was circulating out there?
One of the concerns I had after a while was the degree to which Donald Trump's arguments that I wasn't born in this country were not just getting attention and coverage from marginal news sites or even Fox News, but were rather being prominently discussed and reported on in mainstream news. And I think it is at that point where I realized I can't ignore this because it's actually distracting us from doing the necessary work of the presidency. It's a reminder that democracy is hard. You know, as you point out, I try not to romanticize the past. I always, you know, partly by virtue of being a black man in America, you know, I'm not somebody who is nostalgic in general about how wonderful everything was way back when. But the question for me is always, how do we replicate a common culture, common values, honesty, you know, truth-telling, responsibility? How do we do that in a more diverse, more inclusive America? Because part of what I think drives this splintering of news and opinion and facts and the deep divisions that we're seeing in our society is the fact that it was easier to maintain things like bipartisanship in government or a agreed upon set of rules around news when it was just a certain group of Americans who were the decision makers. And I think when you started seeing African Americans and Latinos and LGBTQ people and women insisting, no, our voices matter too, and contesting for power, it's at that point where suddenly information itself, the stories we tell, become much more contested. For PEN as an organization, it should be heartening to realize that it turns out the pen is mightier than the sword.
You know, it seems to me that your political career, you know, the essence of it has been the search for some, you know, common core of meaning and decency. You've had a unique ability as a political figure to cross racial and ethnic and socio-economic divides. For me, the most revelatory moment in your memoir maybe comes towards the beginning. You're a state senator in Illinois. You described that you like to travel around the state. And the first time you went to downstate Illinois, which is a very conservative place, you said that your chief aide, I think his name was Dan Schoman, wondered how a black lawyer from Chicago with an Arab-sounding name would fare in southern Illinois. I'm wondering, Mr. President, how much of this unusual versatility, if I could put it that way, that you've had as a politician, being able to speak to different groups, how much of that do you think stemmed from your unique biracial identity and the fact that you were a product of two very dissimilar families?
Yeah, I ended up getting enormous support in these pretty conservative, rural, largely white communities when I was a senator. And that success was repeated when I ran for president in the first race in Iowa. You know, by my second year in office, I'm not sure if I could make that same connection because now those same people are filtering me through Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and an entire conservative media infrastructure that was characterizing me in a way that suggested I looked down on those folks or I had nothing in common with them. You know, part of what changed is that back then, you know, if I went into a small town in southern Illinois, I could probably visit the local editor of the newspaper, who might be a conservative guy with a bow tie and a crew cut, probably, you know, doesn't have much use for Democrats generally, but, you know, was somebody who adhered to journalistic norms, was curious, was interested, believed in facts. I could sit down with that guy and, you know, he might write an editorial saying, you know, he's a, you know, young liberal kid from Chicago, but he seemed sensible, had some good ideas. And so that's how people were receiving me, with a different set of assumptions than they would today. And it's yet one more example of how the connections that I may see may get harder to make if we're only understanding people through our phones and our screens, and we're not having the kinds of face-to-face conversations where, by virtue of that conversation and experience, we can recognize ourselves in each other.
I know you've spoken, Mr. President, that you were have been very inspired by the millions of Americans, both black and white, you know, who repeatedly poured into the streets during the past year in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. And for me, one of the most absorbing and revealing passages in your book describes how you decided to frame the issue of race in your 2008 campaign. If I can quote again, you wrote, "I needed to embrace white people as allies rather than impediments to change, and to couch the African American struggle in terms of a broader struggle for a fair, just, and generous society." That approach has had many fans. It's also had some critics. Do you think that that still represents the best approach for the Democratic Party to take in dealing with the historic injustices against the Black community?
I think that there's a difference between politics and getting votes and truth-telling and the prophetic voice. And this is where sometimes my role as politician versus my role as writer can diverge. James Baldwin's A Fire Next Time is a searing account of the original sin of race and how it plays out in the life of a young James Baldwin and the life of Harlem, which, when you reread it today, is as relevant as it was when it was written over 50 years ago. Now, if I spoke the language of James Baldwin as he speaks it on the campaign stump, I'm probably not going to get a lot of votes in Iowa. Even though it is as true and as important a document in understanding the realities of race relations in America as anything that's been written. But James Baldwin didn't have to go out and get votes. We have to speak a language that a broad cross-section of the population can hear. When it comes to, for example, alleviating poverty, what we've discovered, not just recently with Donald Trump, but dating back to the beginnings of this nation and on through Nixon's Southern strategy, is it's very easy for politicians who want to maintain the status quo to fan the resentments or fears of the other in the white population and suggest that it's immigrants or it's blacks or it's somebody who is stirring up trouble and trying to take your stuff. In that context, using a universal language, I think, tends to be more powerful. It is what allows then people to say, oh, okay, you want to help all poor kids. Now, the fact that disproportionately those are black kids, that's important to note. What I think has changed, and we saw this summer, is because of people's witness of George Floyd, because of what seems like a constant stream of irrefutable evidence of excessive force against unarmed black folks, that I think white America has awakened to certain realities that even 20 years ago they were still resistant to. That creates a new opening for a different kind of political conversation. That's part of why I'm hopeful, particularly about the younger generation. If I talk to white friends of my daughter, they have internalized the degree to which there are structures of racism that are still embedded in our institutions and the criminal justice system in a way that their parents might not have been as comfortable talking about. The one thing I became very persuaded about as president is the degree to which policy matters, but culture is what gives you the opportunity then to move forward on policy and to build the coalitions and get the levers that allow you to institutionalize changes. What good politics does is it sees those opportunities and can translate that into votes and legislation. But very rarely do you see the ability to get votes and legislation if the culture is entirely resistant to it.
You have been conspicuous for your faith in the goodness and decency of the American people. Have the years of Donald Trump shaken that faith at all?
One of the great benefits of being president is you got to meet a lot of people, and you traveled in every corner of the country. People's instincts are generally sound. When they're interacting with their family and their neighbors and in their workplaces, they want to do the right thing. The challenge is at the macro level. When you start aggregating people's attitudes and opinions, it is subject to both the information they're receiving through the media and the floating id of fear and angers and resentments. That's not unique to the last 4 years. Let's take a look at post-Civil War and Reconstruction and how rapidly what looked like a new birth of freedom suddenly turned catastrophic for a lot of newly emancipated black Americans. The challenge is not that somehow folks are worse than we expected, but that what we continually discover is that our institutions of democracy, our civic and cultural habits, they have to be nurtured. As you know better than anybody, history can move backwards. It doesn't have to go forward. I have often quoted Dr. King when he said that the arc of moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But it doesn't bend that way on its own, right? It bends because collectively we bend it in that direction, and when we don't, it can bend in the direction of injustice and less freedom and more tribalism and more racism. That's part of the human condition.
Our founding fathers all believed that our republic could not survive without an informed citizenry. And frankly, you know, I tremble for our country when I read in surveys that 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. Do we need to go back to old-fashioned civics classes? It doesn't seem like we're doing a very good job of educating our citizenry in the basic principles and institutions of democracy.
I do. Look, this is something I'm obsessed with because, you know, the horse is out of the barn to some degree. There's going to be a proliferation of news sources, outlets, and the best antibody towards a destructive politics is an informed citizenry. And we're going to have to build up the critical muscles in the public so that they're not just embracing whatever wacky stuff they're hearing on the news or seeing on their phones or in the internet. You and I and anybody who's listening, because we probably have some sort of platform, we probably have a responsibility as well to think about how are young people receiving information in ways that are digestible. Both your books and my books are, you know, they're pretty long, they're pretty dense. And if we want to reach a 13-year-old or 14-year-old just as they're about to start thinking about their role in the world and how they might shape it, figuring out how we, without dumbing down, reformat critical, vital information, history, principles into not just text, but also visual mediums and so forth, so that there are more ways of kids getting introduced to these issues. That's part of the reason why, you know, I loved what our mutual friend Lin-Manuel Miranda did with Hamilton. For a lot of young people, that was an introduction to American history that was interesting. And it may then lead them to read your book or study history in a more serious way because it comes alive. I'm as guilty of this as anybody. There are times where, as Michelle reminds me, I'm so dense and wanting to, provide so much context in this and the detail of that, and that you lose your audience. We're going to have to rekindle the excitement of this American experiment, because it is a fascinating drama of whether we can pull this off, whether we can pull off a country made up of people who come from everywhere, and test whether it is possible to get along and self-govern. If we can pull it off, then it gives hope to everybody around the world, because the world's shrinking and cultures are colliding. And if it turns out that our experiment in democracy can function, then it offers the possibility of other communities negotiating their differences in a peaceful, productive way. And if we fail, then the prospects for success elsewhere dim a little bit.
Mr. President, I thank you. PEN America thanks you. You've given us inspirational words this evening. You've given us cautionary words this evening. This is a very tough moment for nonprofits across the country because of the pandemic. And so we at PEN America are especially grateful that you devoted all this time to us this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I was honored and enjoyed it, and everybody stay healthy and hang in there. 2021 is going to be better.